Hi, and welcome to the Crucible of Thought podcast. I'm Brandon, and I'm here to share things that interest me and things that I think the Lord has brought to my attention. And this is episode number 119. I had a conversation today with Pastor Trey Ferguson. He's a recent author of the book called Theologizin Bigger, which I really enjoyed reading. And he's also starting up a new online church ministry called The Intention Church. And I've been enjoying getting to know him in those online spaces, and I wanted to have a chance to actually talk with him in person at length. So I hope you guys enjoy this interview, and without further ado, here it is. Good afternoon, Pastor Trey. It's so good to talk to you. I feel like we've gotten to know each other a bit over the Intention Church thing the last few weeks, but it's good to have a chance to interview you.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm looking forward to this. I'm excited we were finally able to make this happen. I know we ran into a couple of issues, but such is life, and we're here. That's the important thing.
Yep. Family, and you're kicking off a church here, and that's got to be exciting for you, but I'm sure it comes with a lot of challenges of schedule and focusing on new stuff all of a sudden.
Yeah, something like that. But praise God for supportive communities and technologies that allow us to streamline some of this to some extent, at least.
Yeah, it's been exciting seeing these kinds of opportunities develop since COVID kind of forced us to rethink how we do church in general.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely.
I got a T-shirt during that time that said the church has left the building.
I love it. And so the funniest thing is, like, as you would know by this point, I'm launching the Intention Church, but I'm still involved in the local church. I'm the executive pastor at another church here in Homestead, Florida called the Refuge Church. And about a year before the pandemic, we, based on some other circumstances, actually left the building that we have been in for years, and we're meeting out of a movie theater. Now, of course, that movie theater closes down during the pandemic, as just about everything did. And so for about 2 years, our physical church, like the Refuge Church where I serve, was entirely virtual, right?
Mm.
And that was something that confused people. I was in school at the time as well, and even they were asking questions like, "Oh, how are y'all making it?" I'm like, "Hey, man, like you do what you got to do, and if you can't adjust in times like these, you got to ask yourself like, how committed to the people were you really? Like, what was your commitment to the building or to the people?" And
Yeah.
we found a way to entirely virtual. We didn't have a building. We had a PO box. That was the only physical property we had. A couple storage units around town, and made it through to now we're back meeting in person again, obviously. But yeah, the church left the building for quite some time, and a lot of local church organizations, I should be specific, not the global C church, but the local church found out a lot about itself and where some of its gaps and vulnerabilities lie.
I imagine it freed up a ton of budget for that time too, because you're not paying for lease or rent or ownership fees and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword because at the same time, of course, giving corresponded to the fact that people weren't coming into a building, routines were disrupted. But no, it was definitely a blessing that we were able to cut down on overhead quite a bit during that time. Um, Especially like even when we did resume in-person things, we kind of retooled a little bit, not having a building. We still don't own a building at this juncture, so we rent space out of a school to meet on Sundays. Then we have an office, like we have a suite in an office building where we hold midweek Bible services, rehearsals, small groups, things of that nature. Matter of fact, the office where I am right now is in that office suite, but a lot of that was cheaper than the rent, the mortgage on the building that we were previously occupying. So it's one of those things where circumstances ended up working in our favor in a certain way from the business aspect of things.
Okay. So are you a full-time pastor then? Is that the full-time job?
Yeah, my full-time job, I'm the executive pastor here at the Refuge Church. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm the church's only full-time employee, as a matter of fact. In a way
Okay.
that, yeah.
And about how many people attend?
So right now we are at around, I think we're averaging about 90, which is lower than our pre-pandemic attendance. Like at the height of the church, we were around probably a couple hundred a week. We had multiple services and things of that nature. And then we started to see that go down heading into the pandemic. And we're starting to see the numbers tick back up, but we're around 90 a week.
Okay, that's awesome. Tell me about some of your personal stuff, your background, your where you grew up, where you come from, your spiritual background too. I'm also interested in that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of everywhere on the East Coast. I was born in New York. It's where I spent the first few years of my life. Um, Brooklyn is where most of my family considers home, even though I was there for a few years before we moved to Queens. And basically, by the time I started school, I was in kindergarten in New York, and then we moved to Richmond, Virginia, which is
Oh,
where I spent pretty much all of my schooling years. And I don't know. I know you're around the DMV area, right?
yes. I'm about 2 hours from Richmond, 2 hours from Center DC, 2 hours from Baltimore center town. So kind of right in that
Gotcha.
whole the
You,
quadrant
do you
there.
know the Richmond area at all?
Very little.
Okay, okay, yeah. So yeah, I grew up there for the most part. And then I ended up coming to Miami for college. I went to the University of Miami, where I met this lovely young lady who I ended up asking to be with me until one of us died, and she agreed to that arrangement for some reason, and we had all of these children. That's where I've been since my entire adult life. So I've been in Miami longer than anywhere else at this point.
Okay.
But I consider all of these places home. Home. I have roots in various places. There's family everywhere for me, all up and down the East Coast at this juncture. Now, when you talk about my spiritual life, my spiritual journey, that's um, probably not quite as eclectic. I grew up in the black church tradition, right? Emmanuel Baptist Church is where I spent my earliest days in church. My mom loves telling the story of how I was born on a Wednesday. She brought me to church that Sunday, and we were in church multiple times. And we only lived a few blocks away from the building. And Emmanuel Baptist Church still going strong. Basically a
Cool.
mega church in the area now, right? And they're doing dope things. By the time we got to Richmond, we were still very involved. My mom made sure that we were all plugged into multiple ministries and things of that nature. And I remember at one point I was joking about it this past Sunday in Intention about like the lobby afterwards, people hanging out, and I was like, "Oh my god, I just want to go home." And I remember one Sunday, my mom asking me on the way to church, she was like, "Oh, are you going to church this morning?" And I've never heard her ask that question. It was
Hmm.
never a question. It was always like, "Oh, get up, it's time to go to church." And I thought it was a trick question, and I said no, I'm not going to church. She said okay, and she left me, and I was around probably my mid to late teenage years, and I still identified as a Christian. I still, if you asked me if I believed in God, I would have said yes. I would have said I love Jesus, but I wasn't really interested in doing the whole church thing at that point, which is pretty common for people around that
Sure.
age, right? Like there's some traditions that even build in, like uh,
The
we
wilding
talk about.
years.
Right. Like we talk about the Intention Church being an Anabaptist church. If you look at the Amish of the Anabaptist tradition, like some people know about the Rumspringa, where around that they let you go and decide this is what you want to do, right? And I kind of had that, and part of that is why I ended up in Miami, the University of Miami, because I wanted to live a life. I wanted to have fun and see what the world had to offer, and I was exposed to a lot of things, a lot of different people with a lot of different beliefs. I remember at one point doing class intros. It was the first day of class. Um, and the teacher asked us to go around and introduce ourselves, give us something interesting that people might find. And for some reason, everybody kept talking about how they were raised spiritually. And to a man, everybody around that room would say, like, yeah, I was raised religiously, but I'm not religious now. Like I was raised Jewish, I'm not that. I was raised Catholic, la la la, but I'm not that right now. And I was the only person in the room, even though I wasn't actively attending any church, who was like, nah, I was raised this way, and I still believe all of this stuff, right? And I wasn't fundamentalist in that way or anything, but that Christian identity was, in my mind, a core part of who I was. And at that juncture, it was still a little more like universal. I didn't The fact that my church was black didn't mean anything to me. It's just because I was always around black people when I grew up. Until I ended up graduating from a predominantly white private school. Um, but I lived around black people. I went to church with black people. All my extracurriculars were with black people. So the idea that like my faith was black it never struck me as anything because it was just church, right? Um, and this wasn't until I didn't come to that realization until, interestingly enough, the young lady I met uh, did not grow up in church like I did,
Hmm.
and she was curious about things in the faith. So she asked me if I would go to church with her, and because I liked her, I agreed to go.
Sure.
And I coming back into faith circles, communities of faith as an adult on my own accord, right? As opposed to being dragged. I started taking things more seriously, asking more questions, and eventually I got involved in ministry, first helping out with young people, teenagers, adolescents, things of that nature. And by the time I was trying to figure out what my next steps were, I knew I wanted ministry to be a part of it. So I'd gone to school at a conservative evangelical institution. And that's when I was like, oh, this is different. This is not what I grew up with. This is like, yeah, the language is similar, but the accent is way different, right? Like we said, we talking different stuff over here. And that was kind of disorienting for me at first when I realized that, oh, like the presuppositions are different. The impact is different. The stories that we're associating with, or the meaning that we're associating with these stories and symbols is different. And bridging that gap has been a large part of the work that I do, not necessarily within like my communal ministry, like the preached ministry, but when it comes to the public theology that I do, a lot of that is bridging the gap and bringing to the fore the role that our upbringing plays on our theological expression.
Yeah, I picked up on that in your book. I hadn't had a chance to share this with you yet in our conversations, as brief as they've been, but most of my the changes in my life in the last 4 years sprung from watching right after COVID started, of course, the George Floyd incident.
Yeah.
And talking to a close black friend of mine and hearing his stories for the first time, because I was genuinely heartbroken by what I saw happen, and even more so by what was happening to him. To make a long story really short, we could share this another time. I ended up leaving that church because in large part because I was told I could not talk about racism.
Yeah.
Which had started to break my heart. But one of the things I had already started to do was to help around. There's a local Christian fellowship, which is led by a number of black churches in our area. Serious black churches, not just churches with mostly black people, but with the theology and the worship style and so forth. Like
I hear you.
The Ebenezer Baptist or the African Methodist Episcopals and things like that. So I actually started attending their church on a periodic basis just to begin to understand it better. So I'd go to our church for several Sundays, and then I'd hop over and go meet with them on a Sunday. I started helping them with their sound ministry and stuff like that. And sitting underneath that kind of a ministry and a way of thinking and, sitting in that church on, which Sunday was it? I guess it was the Sunday right around Juneteenth, I guess it was right after George Floyd, was just, amazing to the differences that I discovered. And so that whole language versus accent thing is a really good explanation of that. So yeah, I've seen that now firsthand, and I find a deep love for what I encounter there, but it is so alien at the same time that it's
right.
Just, how do you cross the streams? And people who are black probably encounter that a lot more than us, who tend to stay in the white church a lot. But I think black people have to cross the borders probably more than we do.
Yeah, and I think what I would imagine led to some of that, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You didn't use the word disoriented, but like even like coming to that realization is the fact or the idea that there are people who exist without a desire to fully assimilate into the culture around them, right? Because there's this assumption eventually, and even if you listen to like some of the nonsensical rhetoric that's seeping into our political landscape right now, the idea is that, oh, when people come here, they assimilate into our culture fully. Like that is their goal. Despite the fact that like not everybody who is, particularly when we're talking about the black church tradition, didn't come here voluntarily, right? Didn't even become Christian voluntarily for the large part. And what does it mean that there are some people who believe like, no, there is something about us that is innate to our culture that we feel is worth preserving, and this is how we've done it. And that's something that is easy to miss because if we're honest, for a great deal, the majority even of white people in the United States of America, you can live an entirely meaningful and satisfying life without having one single solitary meaningful relationship with a black person where you share at that level. And so, like, yeah, I'm not shocked to hear when you do like make a habit or a practice of going into those spaces, like, whoa, this is different. Yeah, yeah, it is. And people have been doing that for centuries, proudly, uh, with or without the knowledge and or approval of the dominant culture. Right?
Yeah. Our church, for the church that I left over these issues, uh, for a long time has said, we're a field hospital. And what that means to them is that we accept broken people in here without judgment. And then we fix them up and send them out because we live in a military town. And so there's a lot of transient, they're here for
Mm,
3 years and then they're gone on the next rotation, right? And
yeah,
so the understanding was we're happy to have people come in from all different stations and walks of life and with whatever brokenness they have. And then here they get fixed up and then they move on to the next station carrying something from us with them. What I learned after the fact that was never spoken, and I don't think people even thought about it, was the implicit sense of you're not welcome to stay the way you are. So if you're
mhm,
going to be here, you're going to have to kind of fit in at some level because
yeah,
what you bring in is broken and what we send out has been made whole according to our standards. And that's the part that never
right.
got, so certain theological understandings, that's broken. Certain social understandings, well, we're not going to say it, but that's broken.
Right. And I think the problem with that isn't the idea that we carry brokenness with us, because I think to a large extent that's true. I think that the world that we are forced to navigate is often dehumanizing in ways that we don't realize. I
Mm-hmm.
think the problem arises from the fact that we are now trusting that these people are accurate at diagnosing exactly what is broken.
Right.
And what we have to realize is that throughout history, particularly here on these shores, we haven't necessarily proven the most faithful physicians in that matter. Right. And so we often end up treating that which is not broken while not addressing that which is broken. And then what happens when you do that and you keep on treating what isn't broken while not addressing what is, we don't see any actual results except for this one thing we've been looking at. And we end up blaming the people who are carrying this brokenness for not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Whether we're talking economically or theologically, morally, whatever standard we're judging by, because we aren't always looking at them holistically. We,
And we have a really, I'll use the word broken, sense of what's acceptable to God.
right.
You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
my journey in the last 3 years has basically been to walk away from evangelicalism, walk away from a lot of conservative things because I started to see the harm in them and stuff that we told ourselves from in my case, 40 years. Um, there's a lot of stuff in there that didn't line up with the Bible, but we said, well, this is the way it has to be because
Yeah,
this is our social understanding,
right, right. And
which means we let the Bible get driven by the social instead of the opposite.
absolutely. The way that we approach the Bible, the hermeneutical lens that we're using is informed by our cultural understandings, right? And that's something that we even see happening throughout the Bible. Like a lot of the animosity that we read in the Bible that is born towards certain Pharisees and things of that nature is because people have, okay, this is our interpretation and this is what we're rocking with. When Jesus says, though, okay, but what about this particular interpretation? Is there room for that? And that leads to disagreement, and we see that like happening throughout the gospels, but now we act as though this disagreement among interpretation is somehow new and foreign and dangerous when, well, yeah, there've always been people who do that or who've claimed that disagreement was a sign of danger. But we need to ask ourselves, are we in the proper place to make that judgment? Because a large part of the gospel seems to be that no, as a matter of fact, you're not. And when we cast that judgment, we end up on the wrong side of judgment ourselves.
Yep. It's the assumption that there's only one right answer is a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, and if there is one right answer, the Christian claim, right? The claim of the gospel, of the New Testament, is that the right answer is Jesus, whose command is love, right? Love God, love your neighbor. He said, on this hangs all of the commandments, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If we start with that and then filter everything through that lens, things start making a lot more sense, except that when we're so wed to this idea of a standard that happens to line up with like some people in this country and not others, and and the people like it's way more along socioeconomic lines and racial lines than it is even like theological or claimed orthodox lines, right? Like the standard is way more political than it is religious in a theological sense.
Yeah.
Um,
Are you familiar with the book, The Centered Set Church?
I'm not. No,
Oh, you got to read that. So
I got to
you
check
think
it
you're
out.
bald, right?
You said I'm bald.
You'd call yourself bald, I imagine.
Why would I do that? Yeah, yeah, I'm bald. I'm joking.
Take
Yes.
someone who's got like hair all the way around here and a little thin coating on top, and would you say they're bald?
Ooh, ooh, I hear you. I hear
There's that
you.
line, right? There's
Yeah.
there's kind of an ideal baldness, which I think you exemplify there. But even somebody would say, well, you probably shaved some of that hair off, so you're not really bald. And so there's kind of a standard, but there's not a black and white line that says this is and this isn't. But if I held up an apple and an orange, you could say absolutely one's an apple and one's not an orange. There's no question there whether one thing is perfectly apple and one's not perfectly apple.
Yeah.
So one of those is a centered set, like the idea of baldness. There's something that approaches an ideal or a standard or something that you look to as your goal. And the other is putting boundaries around things and saying this defines an apple. Well, churches do the same thing, right? One kind of
Yeah.
church says, well, here's what it means to be a Christian. And oops, you've asked a new question, so I have to come up with a new rule to define, are you still a Christian? You put bigger and higher walls around those things, and pretty soon you've got this really deep, thing that is only this qualifies as Christian. So now if we start talking about gay rights, or we start talking about abortion, or we start talking about what color your clothing you wear into the building for some denominations, or, are you wearing a long dress or skirt, or is it pants? The walls get higher and higher. That's a bounded set church, whereas a centered set church is we're looking to Jesus, and as long as we're moving towards that standard, you're with me.
I
Very
love it.
different. It's a really, really good book, and it really caught my attention about thinking through how we treat people who differ from us.
I love it.
And, when you start looking at John 17 and Jesus saying, that priestly prayer of Father, make them one, even as you and I are one. How do you do that when people have different ways of coming to God, different understandings of the gospel? And maybe that sense of unity isn't, do you fit this box that I put up around my definition of are you Christian, or is this an acceptable religion to God? And instead say, hey, we're both pointed to Jesus. You can be Baptist, I can be Pentecostal or Presbyterian or United Methodist. You can differ with me on social issues. We're still pointed towards walking towards Jesus, and as long as we agree on that, we can walk in oneness with differences, which is fascinating. So,
Absolutely. And I think there's a whole lot of truth to that. Part of like the whole thesis behind Theologizin Bigger is the idea that the fullness of God cannot be contained in any one of our traditions, right?
mhm.
And the more that we are willing to sit with or sit at the table with people from other experiences and traditions, the fuller picture we have of God, the more high definition this image of God
Yeah,
becomes, and we can formulate that more clearly. And there's a whole lot of beauty in it. So even with the Intention Church, it's an interesting endeavor for me because it is affiliated with a denomination of people who grew up within the Mennonite tradition. Oh, and some people came into it later in life. I am basically brand new. My sympathies have always been Anabaptist even before I knew that. But me
yeah,
coming into this environment has been really interesting because when I go to like annual meetings and I go to inter-Mennonite churches, it's an entirely different experience, but it's so beautiful in a different way. A lot of it is stuff that I probably wouldn't submit to doing on a weekly basis for my own self, but I still recognize the beauty in it. And as you said, like we're marching to the same center. We're agreeing on the things of Jesus. We're agreeing on the narrow way of Jesus and the way of peace and the way
yeah.
of love. And that's something I can get behind, no matter who's doing it.
So I'm glad you brought the book up because I had a few questions for you about that. I'll ask you the how and why stuff a little bit later, but it's a delightfully irreverent book. You seem to revel in that, but I also noticed that you kind of like to poke at the beginning of the chapter, and then you kind of back off of that a bit and get a little more standard in your presentation. But every now and then you throw that little jab in there just to make a point. And how's that been received? What's the take on that?
I think for the most part is been received as I anticipated, right? It's been received pretty well because the book itself is structured around who I am and how I interact normally. The
Good.
first, yeah, like I tried to literally write it in my voice. I wanted to write a book where somebody could read it and feel like they were talking to me.
Well,
And some
that,
of my favorite
yeah.
reviews were people saying exactly that, like, "Oh, I feel like I was talking to Trey." Good, that's what I wanted, right? And it's funny because in the original proposal, it was a little headier than that, a little more heady and formal than that. And somebody was like, "Yo, this is whatever. It's cool. It's sound, but it don't sound like you." And so I had to go back to the drawing board, and that's when the idea of me starting every chapter with a tweet, like a real life tweet that I actually sent out, came into play. And what that did was help me to stay within my own voice. I
Okay.
didn't feel the need to flex a whole lot of academic muscles and prove my bona fides, because one of the things that I found out about the reasons that people connect with me is because I'm so comfortable in my own skin that apparently when I'm comfortable enough, the knowledge ends up coming out on its own, right?
Mhm.
So when you talk about that the irreverence or whatever, that's who I am. Even if you come to the refuge church or if you come to the intention church, you're around them long enough, you're gonna see like, oh, I take my job very seriously. I just don't take myself that seriously. And so yeah, that's it. When I talk about the things of God, I approach it with a seriousness that I hope is evident. But when I am using my voice to shape things around those stories, I like to have fun. I enjoy being me, and I hope that shines through. And
It
not
does.
only that, yeah,
So another thing you lean into is obviously you're perfectly comfortable being black, which good.
yeah, I love it. It's dope. It's lit.
There
If
are
it wasn't
certain
so
cultures
dangerous,
that just
10 out of
get
10, I'd
joy
recommend.
though. So
One more time. Yeah, sorry.
sorry, there's certain cultures that's just like going to offend people, and
Yeah,
okay, I don't care. That's their problem, but
yeah.
that's got to be an interesting thing to come to some people with. Talk to me about black theology versus just plain theology, because I've heard that a lot of times. A lot of different thinkers have pointed that out, and I think it's a wonderful observation. That you said you just grew up in that theology, and you it's like fish in water. You don't think about the fact that you're in that until you
Yeah.
encounter something different. But how do you balance that in your church when you've got obviously a very cross cultural group of people?
So when you say, all right, gotta be careful here. And this is funny. This is the first time I've had an interview since this has been the case. You say my church, you're talking about intention, talking
Well,
about
that's what I
refuge.
see. I've never been to your home church, so
Yeah, so refuge is a real black church. Like
okay.
yeah, it's a lot of black people. And it's interesting because I wouldn't even say that we're that deep into like the black theology of it all at the church, right? You could come in there and be perfectly comfortable from a variety of traditions. And that's the way there are lots of churches with black people that aren't leaning into that all the way, the whole Martin Luther King thing. And that's not to say that we're a church full of sellouts or whatever. It's just not something that's been
Come on.
leaned into there. But when I do, like, cause I preach, I love being black. So it comes out and it's not received negatively at all there, right? When it comes to intention, which is much more multicultural, right? Like if you show up at intention and you've been there, it looks like America,
Yeah.
right? And so you go, there's a cross section of people. Like I haven't done the actual math yet, but I would say that it actually looks pretty close to
All right.
America. And what I try to do is be upfront about who I am. Like if you go to the website, it says that, oh no, this church is ground in the black church tradition and the Anabaptist tradition, so that like you could feel how you feel about it, but we try to warn you on the front end. But what I'm also open about is that I do not view blackness or black theology as a biological reality.
Okay.
It is a political reality.
Yeah, I certainly agree.
Right. I didn't ask to be black. None of my ancestors asked to be. We were named black. Blackness is the only political party where you can be ostracized by the same people who put you in that party. Um, and I shouldn't say blackness. Race is the only way.
Yeah.
The only political lines where that is the case, right? And so when I lean into like the reality of black theology, And one of the reasons why I'm so comfortable with this cross section of Anabaptism and everything is because they share this notion of the political reality of being under the power of empire and people who can and do mean you harm at times, right? And one of the reasons that I foreground that is because I think that that speaks very loudly to the gospel.
Okay.
When we look at crucifixion as a central event in the gospel, and I tend to hold that differently than a lot of Western Christians do. I don't celebrate the crucifixion in the same way. My hope is in the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe in penal substitutionary atonement or none of that stuff. I don't uphold that. But I view the crucifixion as the climax of what it means that God would incarnate in human flesh and the life that God chose to live, right? The crucifixion is the response that we're supposed to be jarred by, offended by. Like, wow, I can't believe that humanity would do this to God. And when you look at it through that lens, Blackness seems almost an appropriate lens through which to view the gospel story, right? You got James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he draws all these parallels between the reality of crucifixion and the lynching tree that happens in the Jim Crow South in particular. And one of the things I say, like, look, this is my reality in these United States of America, and this is who God has been for me and my people. I think that there's a lot of overlap between that testimony and the many testimonies that we see in the biblical account, right? And so when we talk about the discomfort that some people will feel with that and me being that comfortable in there, good. That's one of those good discomforts I'm talking about. Like in the book, I talk about the fact that there's no growth in comfortable situations. Like sometimes growth will put pressure on you. There's growing pains even.
Sure, yeah.
So I want us to sit with that discomfort, because when the Bible says that the gospel is offensive, which it doesn't say in those exact words, but there's reason to believe it. No, these are the things that we're talking about. The scandal of the cross, the idea that the Savior of the world could meet such a grisly end, is rooted in a political reality that is very similar, that rhymes with Blackness.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that I've come to discover in the last maybe 2 years or so has been just how valuable the different theologies of all, and there's black, there's white, there's many others, feminist, womanist, LGBTQ, queer theology, others, and how much we learn from those theologies if we can get off our high horse about, well, there's theology and then there's all y'all.
For sure.
Because I think each of those brings something that is utterly necessary. Here's an interesting thing. One of my spiritual mentors talks about how the description in, I think it's Daniel, about the man above the waters that he has a vision of, and it says his body was like beryl. And beryl is an interesting thing because it's a gemstone that has, I think, 6 different colors. Emerald is one of them. There's a white color, there's a pink version, there's green, there's a kind of just a mild blue color. They're all brilliant and they shine, but there's different colors. And what makes a body of beryl interesting is that it's only complete when it has that mix. So it's even more beautiful.
Yeah.
Not just because it's all one color. And he points out that if you look at the scriptures, that man above the waters represents the corporate man being assembled out of every tribe, tongue, and nation prophetically. So it's a fascinating thing that we need those different things to be complete, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Like, I'm in that church and this just feels weird to me, but maybe they got something I need to learn.
Yeah. One of the things that I lament is the idea, because I want to be clear about the fact that what we think of as like regular Orthodox theology, as opposed to all of these Black liberation, Palestinian liberation, all these other theologies, I think that there are some valuable contributions, and some of the times we miss that because we refuse to let white men do theology with an adjective. They're just doing regular theology. And when we rob ourselves of that adjective, we fail to contextualize that which is actually contextual. Nobody's doing this from a completely objective place. And when we fail to put the adjective on there, right? When we fail to acknowledge that, oh, that's white theology, and it's not a curse word to say that, like, you're doing that from your experience as a white person in the United States, and that's fine. But I think it's important to name that because that tells us something about the story of God. that we'll miss if we assume that this is the story of God, right? Almost like if I were to grab some sunglasses and I put them on and I assume that this was the right way to view the world, that's a good way to view the world if it's really bright outside. But if I pretended this is the default way of viewing the world, I'll forget that, oh, there's some people who maybe the light's not as bright because they're inside and they're taking these off, or they're wearing regular glasses, or they have transition lenses or whatever. But we're missing all of that because I assume just because I got sunglasses, this is the right way to view the world. Right? And I think being able to name the location that we're sitting in and the lens that we're using is important to be able to have honest dialogue about this object that we're all moving toward, which is true.
So you're touching on something that to reach some of these kinds of conclusions that maybe we're not the center of the universe, I think your chapter was titled something like State of Confusion. Is there any kind of way to ease this process of the current word is deconstruction, setting aside some of the things that we grew up with, unpacking stuff, digging down and looking at the foundation and figuring out if maybe that's not the right way to look at things. Maybe it's not the only way to look at things, even if it has rightness to it.
I think we got to have a commitment. Yeah. I think there's a commitment to humility that needs to be pursued and embodied if we're to do this in a way that is fruitful and life-giving. This re-examination of our faith and our truth claims and everything. Learning how to sit in humility with the fact that some of these things we'll never know until Jesus returns, right? Yeah. Like some of these things we're just trying our best at. And I think when I talk about humility and this commitment to humility, I mean an actual commitment. Like you're going to have to wake up every day and meditate on these things. And like, me personally, one of the practices that I've adopted is I like to wake up before the sun does, take walks and stargaze. And maybe that's something that you stay up a little later and you do the same thing. But just thinking about the fact that, oh man, that star is made out of the same stuff as me. Like one of those had to die to create everything that there is right here. And this is both like physics and that's Bible, right? Like God knelt down into the dust of the earth, which physicists will tell you is from a dead star billions of years ago, right? And when you think about the fact that the universe is that large, that expansive, and that I am here but for a breath of time, and it's not an insult to my creator. It's not an insult to me or my being or my essence or whatever. The moment I think about the vastness of the universe, a lot of these things are put into perspective where, look, what we're doing is important, but it's not the end of the world, right? The world has been spinning. It's going to keep spinning for a little while longer, Lord willing. And literally, like, this sounds nebulous or heady right now, but this is something I'm regularly thinking of because at the end of the day, as much as I enjoy talking about this stuff, I recognize that, this is a big old world we got. This is a big universe. This is a big God we're talking about. And I'm not going to get everything right because I'm just me. Mm-hmm. I'm just me. It's a whole lot of people walking around made out of the same stuff as me. And they'll have a whole lot of insight. They'll be right about some things, wrong about others, just like I'll be right about some things, wrong about others. And one of the things that sidetracks us is that we're so committed to being right, to being right. And it's robbing us of opportunities to connect with each other in meaningful ways where we can just learn from each other and not worry about being right, but worry about being with,
One of the things, and the book called With is a really good book. One of the things that caught my attention about something you wrote there, I think in the same vein as you wrote the sentence, I don't know God exists. And that level of humility, I'm chill with that. I've read Richard Rohr, he'll mess with your head. But that's a dangerous phrase for a lot of evangelicals because we tie our eternal destiny in the evangelical church to what you believe, more or less. Yeah. And if you get that wrong, you're going to hell. And so you spend an awful lot of energy trying to get it right, and there's not a lot of room in that for humility. So, if you even say a phrase like, I'm not sure God exists, or I don't know that for a fact, boy, you must be falling off the back of the wagon because you're about to go to hell. And there's not,
So
how do you teach people and that kind of humility without scaring them?
the funniest thing about that is, yeah, you be ready to throw me away. I believe, and I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe the next sentence after that is, I don't know that God exists. Say, I believe that God exists,
Yeah.
right? And I try to draw a distinction between what empirical knowledge is and what faith claims are. That's why a good deal of the end of the book points toward this concept of imagination. At the end of the day, we serve an imaginary God. 1 John 4:12. Nobody's ever seen God, right? And that's in the Bible. I'm not being heretical or being adventurous here. Imagination is not a bad word. It's not, and sometimes we don't, because we're so fact based and we want everything. We want to be able to prove everything. Like, oh no, I know that this is true because the tomb was empty on the wall. Yeah, we believe that because of the testimony and everything, but we can't prove any of that, right? And that's good to acknowledge that this is where our hope lies. This is what we believe to be true, and that is just as powerful a motivating factor as anything else. I don't need it. The moment I make this a matter of knowledge, like, no, I know this to be true and I can prove it. Now I'm walking off the beaten path. I got to fight somebody else's home field. That's when we end up with debates between theologians and astrophysicists. And what's the point of that? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? And now we got to sit here and argue with geologists, and we got to go visit the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. We got to do all of these things. Like, what does that have to do with what Jesus is calling us to? What does this have to do with loving our neighbors? What does this have to do with getting rid of sin around us? Like, I think we're often distracted by that. I can do all of these things that I just named because I believe that God is, because I believe that Jesus is the embodiment of God. And whether or not I can prove that is irrelevant to what this belief is motivating me to do. Right?
Yeah. I started, well, when I started a process of deconstructing a few years ago, literally going through pretty much every doctrine that I'd held, not really willingly, but kind of felt like God kept saying, all right, thanks for figuring that, spending some time thinking about that. Here's the next one. Oh,
Yeah.
real God, I don't want to mess with that, and so bit by bit, he kept like, come on. And I kept saying, all right, God, whatever you ask me to revisit, I will. But the first one I encountered, I've kind of used the language of kind of like, here's what I've concluded for myself, instead of here's what you have to believe to agree with me. It's more of an open-handed, here's my journey, here's what I've concluded, and here's why. I'll be very explicit about that when I write blog posts and stuff about here's my conclusions. But the first one I encountered where I really had to admit that I could not come to a conclusion in a sense of guarantee was the question of the doctrine of hell. Because there's kind of three answers in the Bible that all have scriptural support.
Yeah.
Either hell is eternal and people go there and they spend eternity there, or God just annihilates the people that don't agree with him, or everyone ends up in God's camp after all, after, God spends eternity bringing them around to his way of viewing the world. Pick one.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's much stronger support for one of those three in the end. And I did 4 half-hour videos on that, going through my process. But I had to admit, I can't tell you that this is the right answer, but here's what I believe it should be, and here's what I hope it is, and here's why.
Right.
That was hard for me.
Yeah, and I think doing that wrestling and naming those things is important, because at the end of the day, you mentioned belief and hope, and that's what I end up telling people is, I personally, right, and this wasn't the point of this conversation for you. I can't affirm an eternal conscious torment because it flies in the face of the character of the God that I proclaim, right? It's entirely inconsistent. The same reason why
I rejected.
Right. And I'm a hopeful universalist. That's how I am. And depending on the day of the week, I'm an annihilationist. Right. But like the one that doesn't make sense based on every other theological proclamation I hold and have made is eternal conscious torment, for the same reason that I reject penal substitutionary atonement. But the reason behind that is because of who I believe God to be, and what I believe God to be. Right. And if I can imagine someone who is somehow more gracious, more forgiving, more loving than this God, then this God that I proclaim ceases to be the God that I've been proclaiming. That poses a theological, like, I have to reject some of these things for consistency's sake.
Mhm.
Now, some people will hear that and be like, "Oh, well, you're making up a God of your own imagination." Well, yeah, at the end of the day, all of us are. Like
Yeah.
we all are. And some of us are just more honest about it than others. Like, yeah, that is precisely what I'm doing. I don't want to worship a God that I can imagine another God better than. That doesn't seem logical to me.
And that kind of also, that whole thing you just said goes back to what you said near the beginning of whether or not you start from a conclusion and you build your faith based on that conclusion or vice versa. And if you've concluded that PSA or ECT are the answer, you're going to go find that in your doctrine instead of if you
Right.
start from a conclusion that God is love, God is going to save all, you're going to find a very different answer in the same verses.
Absolutely. And it's the funniest thing to me is people who insist that their position is somehow the biblical one, right?
Yeah.
Because if you take a doctrine like PSA and you ask somebody like, "Oh, how did you arrive there?" What you end up with is this patchwork quilt of scriptures and proof text that are not at all related to each other. But like with somebody skilled enough, they can make it seem like, "Oh, yes, this is what the Bible is consistently teaching." I'm like, well, no, not really. You've taken it's the equivalent of me taking a highlight reel of Kendrick Perkins, right? Who had a decent NBA career, not a Hall of Fame career, but if I take just his highlights and he's just dunking them and blocking people, he's going to look like a different player than the one that we actually had.
Oh,
Because who he actually was a solid, dependable center who helped one championship team, and other teams took a gamble on hoping that he could bring some of that mojo. But that wasn't who he was. Like, he's not going to look like his highlights all the time. And when we sit there and act as though the highlight tapes that we compile are foolproof or the totality of who this guy is, we're doing parlor tricks. That's not honest, right? And I
yeah.
think we got to be able to say that a little more consistently.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think we kind of, we arrive at the conclusion we're going to want to come to in those scripture things. But if we set that aside a little bit and apply that humility that you talked about,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to say, I don't know.
Right.
There's just not going to be that answer that I want. And I think a lot of those apologetics things go back to fear. You know, I have to know so that I know that I'm going to go to heaven. Because if I don't know this, then I'm not comfortable. And so admitting that you don't know that you're right is really, really scary for an evangelical.
Yeah, and I think that some of this has to do with, like you said, wanting to make sure that we're right about the things so that we can secure our salvation or whatever. But I got to a point where, like, okay, I'm honest about something. Here's something. I could be wrong. God could absolutely have decided that the only way he could stand us was by sacrificing his innocent son, who happened to be himself. And PSA is true, and eternal conscious torment is true, and eternal conscious torment is true, and there's this fiery furnace that God's going to send people to suffer in for eternity, and all of that stuff could be true. But I'm courageous enough to say that that is not the sort of God that I would want to spend an eternity with. Like a God who would send me into that fiery furnace for not believing that he's capable of that, right? Which is what some people are.
Predetermined that before you were even created.
Right. But like, so me saying like, oh, like, I don't think that God would do something like that. If me thinking that offends God to the point where I would be condemned to that fate, even as I preach the love of God, right? Like, if that's the type of God we're dealing with here, I don't want no part of that, right? Like, that's me, and I'm bold enough to say it. Like, why would that be a God that I deemed worthy of my worship and my affection? And we have to ask ourselves what that says about us, because when we ascribe attributes to God, what we're saying is that these are worthy of imitation, that this is who I should aspire to be. If we are worshiping a God of vengeance, then we will become vengeful people. Some people will try to keep that off and be like, oh, the scripture says vengeance is mine, says the Lord, or whatever. But no, we see it happening in real time. As we condemn actions in real time, we say like, oh, that's wrong. We'll be like, well, God did such and such. Okay, but you said that was separate. So we become what we worship.
And what I grew up in, my personal character needed, uh, I think my personal character needed a ruler and not a friend
Mm.
as a God. That the way I was raised, whatever brokenness there was, whatever things that God made in me there was, needed, at least when I was younger, a God that was above my control or above my ability to say whether I agreed with him or not. And so I fit very naturally into that language of evangelical control and authoritarianism, and God says it, therefore I believe it. I don't care if I like it or not. That's the way God is. And what I've come to realize is that that is driving a lot of what's going on in society right now.
Yeah.
And because I watched the fruit of it, that was one of the conclusions that led me away from that, was watching the fruit play out on the streets.
Yeah.
So,
Donald Trump makes a lot more sense when you realize that people were able to fall in line because there are people who are worshiping a narcissist and a bully in some ways. And I don't mean that to just be provocative. What I'm saying is, when we say these things like, oh, well, God said it and that settles it, and that is how it should be,
mhm.
if the God that we're talking about is indeed good. But if
Different definition of good, isn't it?
right, like if we have to call what is clearly not, if anybody else did this and we would call it not good, but because God's doing it now, we have to call it good. We got to ask ourselves if the word good has any value to it, right?
Yeah.
And and when we're willing,
We'd spend hours down this chain, couldn't we?
yeah, most definitely. And we shouldn't not this particular time, but yeah, I think it's an important insight when you look at the fruit of it. Is what I'm getting at here. When you look at the fruit of what does this construct and this idea of God yield in our society,
Yeah.
I think that can be a harrowing experiment to just look at what that fruit is.
But at the same time, I can really, because I lived there for 40 years or more, I can really identify with the people who look at something like we're talking about with a lot of trepidation and say, well, look what's happening to society now because you guys, meaning people who are looking at the world liberally, are letting the rules go to hell in a handbasket, and so our society is too. And so we have to get America back to that thing because that's where we have righteousness and justice, and they mean different things by those terms. But I can really identify with that pain and that angst over what's happening now because I lived there for a long time. I was every single day Rush Limbaugh for 3 hours kind of guy, you know.
Ooh.
To this day, when 12:06, I see 12:06 on my watch, my brain says, "Oh, Limbaugh starts now." I mean, he's been dead for how long now? And my brain still goes there, you know. So,
yeah,
you know, I can identify with that. So the question then becomes, how do we live as one with people who have that level of need for that kind of a God? And I don't. Good time to bring up the book Faith After Doubt. If you haven't read that one, man, that was a amazing thing for me because he talks about the stages of faith, and stage one is certainty and dualism, and there's a black and there's a white, and that's just the way it has to be. At the other end of the spectrum is the stage four harmony, where all things are good, all things are righteous, and you can live with or without that dualism. And a lot of people exist in that black and white world of, I need a God that is absolutely this or that, true or false, good or bad. And there's people that live in the whatever world, like Richard Rohr, and they're all stages of the same faith and the same God, but they look radically different from one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so can I live in my world and let my friend who's a stage one thinker live in his world and recognize we're both, and that back to the centered set thing, we're both walking towards Jesus. So can I let him be without saying you're wrong for not being where I am, and vice versa? And that's hard.
Yeah, I think this upsets some people when I say this, but one of my genuine prayers that I have to keep around every now and then for certain people, because when I talk about like, oh, learning to love enemies, I mean that, and I have to frame like what is love, right? And my simple definition is that love is the commitment to wholeness. Can I remain committed to your wholeness even as we are at odds to just about everything? And so a genuine prayer of mine is, may the Lord bless and keep you far away from me.
Fiddler on the Roof.
And yeah, and I mean that sometimes. I'm like, okay, right now, based upon where we are and the way, because a lot of times a common refrain of mine is all I do is mind my business and crack jokes. Like I don't feel the need to beat anybody over the head with this. I make proclamations in community of people who have asked me to lead within faith communities, and I take that responsibility seriously. When it comes to apologetics, in the sense of providing a reason for my faith, I could do that. When it comes to apologetics, in the sense of arguing with people, I'm not going to do that. I don't have the time for it. And there are some people who view that as their calling.
Yeah.
In my experience, at least, a lot of them are in that phase one area that you talk about, because there is a degree to which they feel as though, oh no, this is, and I need to be able to defeat these arguments and these stances in the public square. I'm like, cool. I don't want to be your partner in doing that though, because I have other things to do. That's not to belittle you as a person or whatever. That's just not the work that my soul must have. And so I am committed to your wholeness. I do not know if I can be an effective vehicle for that or an effective avenue for that. And that's part of what humility is as well. I don't think that I have what it takes to convince you of another way of being at this juncture in time. And that's not to say that what is right now is what always will be, but I recognize when we're wasting our time.
Yeah. And that shows up in your socials all the time is the sense of I'm me. Y'all come with me or don't. And I love that.
Yeah.
I love that approach. So let me ask you this last question about the book, the chapter about the faith that shapes tomorrow. Can we actually come up with a new faith or a bigger faith in your language that'll do anything more than just become yet another denomination out of the how many thousands that we already have? Or is it okay if it is just another result, another denomination? Can we get to something bigger and more inclusive and expansive?
I think that the answer to that question is ultimately we will inevitably end up with something that is more inclusive and expansive, right? And I say that this is going to sound a little more nebulous than I wanted to, so I'm gonna try to bring this in, right? In order for something to be born, something has to die, right? That's the circle of life, right?
It's biblical. Once
Right.
the seed of wheat falls to the ground and dies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I say that because when you talk about other denominations, and it sounds as though like one of the presuppositions behind that is that, oh, like we just keep splitting things. Like, yeah, we're seeing that play out in the one denomination that I'm officially a part of or on the way to being a part of. There's we've seen a bit of fracturing over some issues, and we're seeing that play out across pretty much all of the major denominations over what are ultimately political issues disguised as theological ones and all of these things. And yet it's a little discouraging in some senses until you start lifting up the hood and you see that what we're actually dividing over is exactly how inclusive we should be.
Mm-hmm.
And my belief is that as we examine the result of all of these fractures and look at some people standing on their convictions that, no, I believe that my God is big enough to set a place at the table of communion and fellowship for somebody like this or somebody like this. I think that ultimately that is a more persuasive love. When I talk about being a hopeful universalist, my hope is that that is the type of love that will draw people in eventually. Like, what does Jesus say? That the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's a small seed that eventually becomes the biggest one, where even the birds of the air have to take refuge in its branches. Like, oh my goodness, I'm tired of running from this. I might as well take a breath. I might as well sit at your table. I might as well find my place here. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these divisions end up being like, yo, we want to make a space for these people, for these siblings, for these children of God. Some people are like, well, this violates my convictions, and we're going to split over that. My belief is that at the end of the day, that place will still be open when people are ready to stop, when people grow tired of erecting these walls and these boundaries around the table of fellowship that God set before us. Not that we set, that God set, right? And so we talk about the faith that shapes tomorrow. My faith is in that table that is so large in my Father's house are many mansions, right? The faith that shapes tomorrow is believing that all of those empty spaces around the table that were voluntarily vacated by people being like, no, we're going to set another table where there's not so many seats, because that they'll come back and be like, look, man, like, yeah, is there still room for me? And the answer will be yes. My faith is in that type of God and that type of kingdom, that type of situation. Um, and ultimately, yeah, there are people who will hear me saying that, and they'll be like, oh, he's staking out a side here in the spectrum. Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. My side is in a God who is so relentless in pursuit of all of the children of God that eventually we won't have nothing to do but kick off our shoes and recline at the table that we resisted once upon a time.
Yeah, it's a wonderful vision. I'm curious how your book's been received, because you cover so much of this in that book, and it's a very widely varied book. Has it been good?
Yeah, I haven't had. So the cool thing about going with the smaller publishing house is that it didn't really like make major waves, right? Like it didn't end up in front of people who were there just to tear it down. Because there are some people, nerds, who like to read stuff just to disagree with it. I haven't maybe those people out there. I haven't really come across that. For the most part, my book has found its way in front of the people that I would have hoped have found it. People who were looking for a gentle landing and a way to frame their journey, even if they're in the wilderness at this point or whatever. And so my book has been received in the spirit that I had hoped, which is one of curiosity and not condemnation.
That's cool. That's really good. Do you have ideas for another book? Are you going to take another?
I have several ideas, and they're all like just the zygotes of books right now. I don't have any outlines. There's nothing coming hot down the pipeline. It's funny because I had like 3 half cooked ideas, and I was on a run the other morning, and this is how it always happens. I was like, oh my gosh, this would be an amazing book. By the time I finish my run, I lost half of it. I have an idea. There's a title and a subtitle. I'm not going to let it out the bag yet, but it's cool. A few different things cooking. Yeah.
I look forward to seeing what that's going to be, and I want to talk to you a little bit after we're done about your book writing process, because I've been thinking hard lately. You mentioned Intention Church a lot. I've been happy to be online for several of those meetings now. How can people get connected with that?
Yeah, the best way is to visit theintentionchurch.com. Follow us on all the social media channels at Intention Church. We meet on Sundays right now at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Time.
Eastern, whatever time.
Yeah, Eastern Time. 4 p.m. Eastern is when we're meeting together collectively. It's Zoom right now, but even if you can't make that time, because I know we got people literally around the world who can't make that time work for whatever reason, or people who are here and just got other stuff to do at that time, you can connect in our Facebook group or our Discord server where we pray for each other. We have conversations. We check in on each other, and we're building actual community. But theintentionchurch.com. You can even sign up for our email listserv to find out all the wonderful things we got going on.
That's awesome. And I'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes. And also, where can people find you on the socials other than the church site? What's your personal socials, on Twitter or Threads?
Most definitely. I'm at Pastor Trey 05. That is TREY 05, like the area code 305, Trey 05.
Okay.
On pretty much all of the social media sites. And if you can't remember what all of those are, everything is linked to my website, PastorTrey05.com. That's PastorTrey05.com. You can actually subscribe to my Substack newsletter from there. You can check out both of the podcasts that I participate, co-host in. You can find all of my social media links right there. You can check out messages that I've preached outside of the Intention Church, all those things on the website.
And I assume they got links to your book there too. And I know I found it on Amazon with just 10 seconds. It's not a common title, the Theologizin Bigger.
Theologizin Bigger. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's an awesome title to kick something like that out. So, well, I've had a wonderful time, and I could seriously talk for another hour with you about some of this stuff. I got probably about half of my questions. Never got a chance to talk to you about them, but
That's the way it's supposed to be.
yeah, I hope we could do this again sometime.
Most definitely.
So I will sign off here, and let's hang on for a minute because I'd love to ask you a couple other questions off the air. But so thank you so much. Bless you, and we'll do this again, I hope.
Oh, most definitely. It'll be awkward if I said no, because you be hanging around my church. I can't go around ignoring people like that. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. But most definitely, this has been an honor and a pleasure, and I remain committed to your wholeness, my brother.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I enjoyed talking to Pastor Trey. He's a fascinating guy, and I'd love to spend more time with him, but we just ran out of time tonight. So hopefully I have another chance to interview him. He's got a lot of important things to say and important questions to ask the church, and I think it deserves digging into a little bit deeper. At any rate, it was good to have you with us tonight. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk again soon.